Hello, and welcome to Europe's Climate and Environment, a podcast by the European Environment Agency, where we dig into the latest data and information on Europe's climate and environment through the insights of our experts.
If you see ecosystem collapse, it cannot no longer provide all these services that we benefit from. And I think we should also think about resilience as society's resilience. For example, society's resilience to absorb climate change also depends on how we use nature. I mean, we should use nature much more to act as a buffer, so we don't have these, for instance, like severe floods that we saw, or droughts, etc. Right? So again, working with nature is also a way forward.
Hello, my name is Constance Brandt, and welcome to today's show. We continue our special episodes on Europe's Environment 2025 report, which was launched in September. Today's focus is on Europe's nature, biodiversity, and water. A crucial part of the health of our environment is the state of our nature and our waters. We dig into the details in our report with our experts. Today we're joined by Caroline Wally and Frank de Larsen here in the EA. Perhaps a short introduction of both of you, Frank?
Yes, thanks. Yes, I work here at the EA as an expert on biodiversity knowledge. So I work on various issues related to biodiversity, like covering the international biodiversity policy files, but also on various issues on biodiversity assessments in general.
Caroline?
Hi, so I work on chemicals in water, in the water and freshwater and marine team, and I've got a background in environmental policy.
Great. Now today we're talking two very key issues in Europe's Environment 2025 report, nature and water. Much of what underpins our society and our livelihoods are connected to nature and water and our well-being. So I guess I would start perhaps with a reflection on the key roles both biodiversity and water play for humankind. Frank, you want to?
Yes, as you rightly point out, biodiversity and ecosystems kind of underpin human society and our economy and our human health and well-being. I think it's also important to say that it also has like an intrinsic value. So it also has, you can argue it has a value in itself, but it definitely supports human society. And that's so basically ecosystems and biodiversity provide a wide range of so-called ecosystem services. Could be like fertile soils, pollination, so we can produce food. It's like regulation of our water, cleaning the air. It's fighting against climate change. So nature, for instance, forests and wetlands can store carbon, but also help mitigate flood risk, etc. So nature is also a key ally to climate change. So we have this huge dependency on nature, which is also reflected. The European Central Bank had a study that showed around 75% of companies in the euro area zone is dependent on at least one ecosystem service. So basically you have that huge economic dependence, and the World Economic Forum rank biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse as the second highest risk in the coming decade because of that dependency. So it really shows that nature is not a nice to have, it's really like fundamental for human society.
Yeah, and Caroline, what do you think about the value of water? I mean, perhaps stating the obvious, but perhaps stating what's necessary.
Well, I think, water is, obviously we need it to live. All life relies on having clean water to live on. We need it to drink, to survive. We need it to grow our food. But we also use it for things like industry. We use it to power, for energy generation. And it's completely intrinsic into our way of life, being clean and healthy, being able to wash our hands, being able to carry our sewage away. These are all things that we as people use water for. And our society would rapidly collapse if we didn't have access to sufficient water.
Our state of environment certainly highlights there are a lot of problems with nature and biodiversities. Frank, perhaps you can get into detail on the pressures on biodiversity. And firstly, perhaps, what do we mean by pressures?
Yes. Before I say that, maybe just to say it's very clear that we have a biodiversity crisis. It's global at scale and it's also well documented. But if we zoom into Europe, we're not exempt, right? So we have a biodiversity crisis in Europe too, where our biodiversity in our freshwaters, in our terrestrial and our marine environments are in a poor shape. And they're actually under pressure, right? So normally talk about 5 pressures. So that's like a land and sea use change. So for instance, like intensive agriculture, it's like urban expansion. We have pollution pressures from pesticides, from nutrients, and now also from plastics. We have invasive alien species, where you have new species coming into ecosystems and disrupt. And we have, of course, climate change, which we're the fastest warming continent, as you know, and the temperatures are set to increase, right? So all these pressures are kind of working together, so they don't work in isolation, they interact, and they can also exacerbate one another. So for instance, climate change can exacerbate other pressures. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that we think about these pressures in a cumulative way. So even if we just wanted to keep status quo, because climate change is going up, we will actually need to reduce some of the other pressures. So that's the reality of the situation.
And what are the root causes? What's
Yeah, exactly. The fundamental root causes is very much related to how we produce and consume, especially food. So we know we have agriculture is kind of behind a lot of the pressures we see on biodiversity, for instance, pollution pressures, intensive agriculture that kind of simplify the habitats. And that, of course, relates to the food we produce, but relates to the consumption, the diets that we have, and that we also waste food along the production chain. So fundamentally, we need to kind of have a more sustainable food system in order to ease some of these pressures. Of course, we also need to kind of protect nature and restore nature, but we also need to kind of address the root causes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll get back to solutions and a bit later. But Caroline, what do you think what Frank said, also in terms of the situation for water?
Yeah, I mean, Frank's highlighted the sort of global crisis and European crisis we've got for biodiversity. And if we zoom into freshwater habitats, countries have actually reported to us that over half of Europe's surface waters are affected by things like barriers and changes to the way that the water flows. So you can imagine if you stick a dam across a river, then the fish and species can't migrate up and down. So that's, that wipes out things like that. So we've had big salmon collapses, for example, and things like this. But then we also, maybe it's more subtle, but what's called connectivity, so allowing streams and rivers to connect and make sure that the species can move around and that there's clean water going through. And even more subtly, when you change the way that the river can flow, so if you put a sort of a blockage in like a dam or something, then that changes the flow of the water. So if you're a fish that needs to lay its eggs in gravel, what happens if you've got slower water, then the gravel gets covered up by silt and clay, so it's muddy. So then that fish hasn't got anywhere to lay its eggs. So these sort of basic changes in the habitat mean that you lose species because they can't reproduce themselves, they can't find the food they need. So these are the sorts of things that are going on at very large scale across Europe. So it's sort of these sort of barriers and there's changes to the way we let our rivers flow, really having a fundamental effect on biodiversity. And they're difficult. These are really difficult to undo because some of these, like, people want hydropower, people, they built historical dams, they put, they flood protection. There's reasons people have done this, but we have to sort of find more sustainable ways to meet these human needs as well as allow biodiversity to come back and get back to a more stable situation.
Mm-hmm. And specifically, what other challenges do our water bodies? I mean, we're talking about lakes, ponds, rivers, groundwater,
yeah,
and coastal seas as well.
Yeah. So another big area is pollution. I mean, Frank's mentioned the pressure from agriculture, but actually another big area for surface waters is atmospheric pollution.
We're still seeing mercury pollution.
Oh, well, unfortunately, things like mercury, once they're in the water, they stay there. That's one of the difficult things. It's been taken into the atmosphere and it's been rained out over much of northern and central Europe, and half of surface waters are failing for mercury, and it's very difficult. Once it's there, mercury is an element. It's not going to degrade. It's just going to keep cycling around. So these sorts of pollution pressures are really problematic. But also in the report we've just released, we've done an analysis of the substances reported by countries, and brominated flame retardants, which are a substance where the standard is set to protect human health, they're also failing over half of Europe's surface waters. So that's our rivers and lakes and coastal waters. So these are really problematic substances.
And what about pesticides and nutrients?
Pesticides and nutrients, they're there, but in particular in groundwater. So the groundwater is a really important resource for us in Europe. 2/3 of its drinking water comes from groundwater. So we must really protect it. And agricultural pressure, both from pollution but also from abstraction, taking it to irrigate our crops. These are major pressures on our groundwater sources.
And what's the top water issue right now?
Well, I would say climate change, actually, because resources. So we have to have water. As Frank mentioned, climate change goes across all of these things. And so the pressure on water resources, simply having enough, is absolutely key, and we must take action to address this.
Caroline, Frank, just perhaps anecdotally, have you seen the changes where you live in nature and in water? Frank?
I think what we all know, I mean, in the childhood when we were driving in the car, the windshield would be full of insects, right? And when you drive around the landscape in the countryside, you don't see that anymore, right? So just the abundance of insects have just really decreased a lot over the past decades, right? I think that's a way where we all kind of see it from our daily life.
Yeah. Caroline.
And then so you get these in England, the parts of England, you've got these chalk streams that have seasonal flow, and they had a very special habitat type. Most of those don't work anymore because they rely on seasonal flow of water, and the water isn't there, or the water that is there is too polluted. So, this is like a clear loss of a very special habitat.
Like, of course, insects and so forth, and fish. But what impacts are we seeing in people's lives on this degradation?
There have been a lot of climate disasters, right? So I think nature can really help kind of mitigate some of these climate risks. We talk about nature-based solutions, right? So if you don't have the floodplains that are really working on it, then you can have floods, right? And we have seen a lot of these over the summer in Europe, right? So that also related to that. We have degraded nature, and we have really worked against nature, no? And I think working more with nature, we can actually adapt better to climate change, for instance.
Mm-hmm. And what about the economy or security even?
So it was theoretical, but it is happening, is that you get conflicts in water use. So when you've got a resource that people need, and people need water, we need it for agriculture, we need it to drink, we need it to do all sorts of things. If there's not enough water, there'll be conflict. We're beginning to see that. In France, there's a commune where it was needed for agriculture. The agriculturers wanted it, but the citizens wanted it for their drinking water supply. And so you get this conflict between people in the same commune have all got legitimate uses,
sure,
trying to manage this very precious resource. And this is really of a concern in terms of how the resources predictions are for Europe going forwards. This is a major concern.
You can also see like a lot of economic actors are really taking this seriously, right? So like the European Central Bank are really looking at the risk to the financial system. We have like the World Economic Forum, which is like this is the second highest risk in the coming decade. So I mean, there's a lot of actors that are not normally concerned about nature that are really paying attention because of this dependency. So I think there's a more like better understanding in decision-making bodies that this is actually an important issue because we have seen this degradation of nature over many decades now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Of course, our State and Outlook report makes clear that unsustainable production, as you mentioned, and consumption, especially from the way we produce food and make things, is harming our nature. What can you say about that more?
No, exactly. So that's both harming our nature in Europe, but it's also like resulting that we have a biodiversity footprint elsewhere through our imports from, for instance, biodiversity-rich countries. I mean, if you look at the landmass in Europe, I think 39% is like agricultural area, right? And a lot of that is also intensely agriculture. So there's these pollution pressures, and that's very much related to that we have a lot of animal-based products being produced, and we know animal-based products have a higher environmental footprint, both when it comes to biodiversity, but also climate, right? So I think eventually we need to kind of transition into a more sustainable food system to really reduce the pressures for agricultural land, and then we can have less intense agriculture. But of course, as I also said, it needs to go hand in hand with like protecting nature and also restoring nature, right? But again, we need to go to the root cause.
Of course, perhaps that's a good segue now into what solutions we're working on, what policy areas, what actions on the European level, the EU level. And the EU has taken action in these areas already. There are quite a lot of policies, part of the European Green Deal, which are outlined in the report as well. Can you explain what these policies are, what these measures, what these actions are, and others being considered?
Yeah, so some of, very recently the EU adopted the Nature Restoration Regulation, which is a very important piece of environmental law that was adopted earlier this year. And basically the aim is to kind of restore ecosystems in Europe, both on land and on seas. But of course that needs to be implemented now. So it will take some time before we see the effect, but we definitely hope that will result in a better state of nature. And that we already have a lot of environmental legislation, the so-called nature directives, etc. But I think, for instance, when we look at the common agriculture policy, there's been some criticism also from various parties that they're still not doing enough to make agriculture sustainable. So I think on the more biodiversity policies, I think they're really good, but we don't really have policies that more address the more systemic issues and the root causes.
And what about for the water area? I know you can also allude to perhaps the State of Water report and water resilience.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, because as Frank said, water has been taken really seriously. Actually, earlier this year, the European Commission published its water resilience strategy, setting out a series of actions to ensure that water is going to be available for European citizens and the environment going forward. So there's a number of actions there, but there's also been a whole series of legislation on the water legislation. So the recently revised Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, the Drinking Water Directive, and then there's a new water reuse regulation to allow water to be reused for agriculture, safely reused. So really water is well covered in the European legislation. And part of the evidence base for that is the State of Water report, which actually we used, which we published last year. part of it was setting out the reporting from member states under the Water Framework Directive. And that's how we know very well what's going on in the countries, because countries have told us about the main pressures on water, the pollution, there's the barriers and those sorts of things, and the resources. So, it's really, we've got a very good understanding for freshwater of what the situation is, and it's serious. And this evidence base is allowing the European Union to build the legislation and build policies and strategies to take it forward and try and, ensure a better situation in future.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps just a segue on that, I mean, a lot of people might wonder, well, where's your information coming from? I mean, we have the State of Nature coming possibly next year already,
yes.
and the State of Water just out, which feed into Europe's Environment 2025 report. But I mean, where are we getting this data from on the water, for instance?
So in water, we're blessed with a lot of data.
Yeah.
And part of the job of the European Environment Agency is to collect that data in a robust manner and make sure it's comparable, so that actually the European Union has got a good understanding about water. It's under the water legislation. So there's about 6 or 7 directives. I've mentioned some of them. There's also bathing water. People might be familiar with floods directive. And out to sea, there's Marine Strategy Framework Directive, but there's a whole range of legislation designed to ensure that we've got a good understanding of what's going on there, and that report, and those countries report to the agency, and we prepare the data and make it available, and then report on it, so that countries and the Commission can see what further action might need to be taken.
So similarly, we get a good idea of how the state of our rivers and lakes and ponds are doing through the data collection and monitoring.
Yes.
And what about on nature? How does that work?
Yeah, and that's the same. So we have, for instance, the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive, where we get reporting from the member states, which we then compile at the European level. And now with the nature restoration regulation, then we'll have the new data coming in, but of course not soon, but I mean eventually. And then we also have other reporting flows and protected areas, etc. Then we also have indicators and various species like birds and butterflies, which very much rely on also like volunteers kind of collecting that data and then being put together. So there is different data sources, both from legislation, but also from elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Caroline, building resilience is a big buzzword at the moment, building water resilience. Perhaps can you explain what it means for waters, Europe's waters?
To be honest, it's about making sure people have got a future.
Yeah.
It's all about humans having sufficient water and looking at it in the broad picture. So thinking about the biodiversity. It's not just making sure I've got this much water and it's like it's in my reservoir and that's fine, thank you very much, because that isn't sustainable. Actually, building resilience is about making a sustainable way to produce our food, to ensure that biodiversity, so that the ecosystems can run and do things like reduce flood risk, ensure there's enough water for food, and it's a whole series of. It needs to be coordinated and understood how you contribute to that resilience. So because people will work on one area probably because it's like deep and involved, but it's contributing to a bigger whole.
And what about the nature area?
So in the context of nature, I think resilience is about the capacity of species and ecosystems to kind of absorb changes, right? And I think because we want these ecosystems to provide the functions, all these benefits we rely on, right? So for instance, that's why the World Economic Forum rated as a high risk. Like if you see ecosystem collapse, it cannot no longer provide all these services that we benefit from. And I think we should also think about resilience as society's resilience. For example, society's resilience to absorb climate change also depends on how we use nature. I mean, we should use nature much more to act as a buffer, so we don't have these, for instance, like severe floods that we saw or droughts, etc. Right? So again, working with nature is also a way forward.
And it's things like preventing pollution. I mean, do the easy stuff. It's not easy to prevent pollution, but there's some things that if you prevent something happening, that makes it a lot easier downstream. And then things like working with nature. And that means working with landowners, land managers upstream to protect water downstream. So there's all sorts. It might be a factory, it might be a farmer, there's all sorts of actors in here. It's about not chucking things down the drain that pollute something you found in the cupboard. You don't know what it is, just sticking it down the drain and thinking your wastewater treatment plant will do it all right, thank you very much, because they poison the system, all right, and then that poisons the river. So, it's really about everybody from all levels thinking, okay, how do I better protect my water, my nature, and what can I do? How can I, in my garden, can I put in a bug nest? And, there's lots of little things can actually contribute.
Yeah. I mean, how long does it take measures to actually see results, to see positive change? How long does that take? in nature and water?
So I think for nature, it actually takes a while. So I think nature is like this slow system, right? So you can do some positive actions, but it might take a while, maybe even a decade, before it really shows. I mean, so I think nature works on a slow pace to some extent. So for instance, we have seen that the coverage of protected areas have increased quite a lot over the past decade, and that's of course really good. But that hasn't necessarily translated into like a better state of biodiversity. Partly it takes time, but they also need to be well managed and be in the right places and stuff like that. But I think there's a bit of a time lag in some natural systems, and with water, I don't know whether.
Well, water, I mean,
it's
yes,
a bit
when
more
you're relying,
responsive, no?
in terms of ecosystems, same issues. It does take a long time, but actually things can be quite quick. There's a site in Goldysworthy in East Anglia where they put in wetlands to protect the downstream, to better reduce the poor water quality coming out of a wastewater treatment plant. And they thought, okay, it's going to take a few years for this to get better. Within a year or two, the nature was coming back. You reduce the nutrients, and make it a nice place, that actually better habitat. Nature's really good at surviving, all right? It might not be quite the nature that was there originally, but something will come back. Resilience is about making sure there's enough water for us. Because I've got no doubt that nature will, whatever we do to the planet, nature will be able to come back and survive and find a way through. But the thing is about making it safe enough for people to be able to survive in a comfortable fashion.
I mean, overall, the report is rather sobering, and Europe's climate environment is in a dire situation, certainly. But there are reasons for hope, and perhaps we could end our interview, perhaps if you can point to some of the reasons for hope for positive.
Yes, as I mentioned, so we just adopted in the EU this nature restoration regulation, which is an important piece of legislation, right? So I think that will have an effect, all other things being equal, right? And I think we're also seeing this expansion of protected areas, etc. So I think we are moving in the right direction. Then, of course, is it at a scale that is needed? And can we do it without really dealing with the underlying drivers? But I think there's more awareness about the systemic challenges, for instance, with an unsustainable food system. It's not just for biodiversity, it's for pollution, it's for climate change. So we need to kind of tackle these issues at the root. And I think maybe not just right now, but in general, I think there's an increased understanding of that. So I also think we're walking towards more systemic solutions over time.
Thinking about sustainable agriculture, it makes business sense to reduce your use of things that cost money, like pesticides and nutrients, if you can find more sustainable way of doing things. If you've got water and the water becomes a problem, there are solutions, and we know farmers are quite innovative if they're given the right incentives. But I think more generally, people are pretty innovative. And one of the things about water is there's a commercial incentive for people to come up with good, interesting solutions. The regulation is giving clear standards and expectations of what's needed from the water industry and the water sectors, and that's a real opportunity. And I've got quite a lot of hope that people are going to come up with some smart solutions, because they've got a structure. You can see there's going to be commercial incentives as well as moral and the rest of it. But there are commercial incentives, and people are pretty innovative if they're given the right conditions for that. So I'm pretty hopeful.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So this is part of the show where we ask our guests what drives them to work in the climate environment area. I guess we'll start with you, Frank. What got you into this area of work?
Yes, since I was a kid, I've always been fascinated by nature. I think I read all the books about wildlife at the local library. I watched a lot of documentaries. I really have that fascination that we share this planet with millions of other species. And I still have that today, so I kind of studied biology for the same reason. But also really saddened by it to see that we're actually seeing this loss of biodiversity. I felt that as a kid, and I feel it now. So then it's really satisfying to work at the EA, where we kind of try to share light on the biodiversity crisis, and that these crises are interlinked with other things. So try to put more knowledge into action. So I think, so that was my intro to this.
Caroline, what about you?
Yeah, well, I guess it goes back to when I was about 17 or 18. I was doing chemistry. I quite liked chemistry, and we did something on water. That was super fascinating. It was about the physical structure of water. I could go on. That was interesting. But I was wondering what to do, with my life. And then the Greenpeace bus came to the high street, and I was going in there every lunchtime. I thought, oh, this is interesting. At that time it was things about acid rain, it was things about whale slaughter. And I thought, okay, this is something that I could find interesting. And then I found there was a new course called environmental science. And I was very lucky to go to a course in Plymouth where I could do environmental chemistry. And that really sort of opened my eyes to the world of chemistry, and how, something that I found relatively easy and other people found difficult was quite helpful for getting a job, and I've been able to work in it ever since. It's the joy of the subject, the interest in it, and then water is just endlessly interesting because there's so many dimensions. There's economic, there's biology, there's physics, there's scientific, it just goes on and on. So it's just that you would never be bored in water. So I'm still happy. Oh, legislation. I do like legislation. So yeah, it's super interesting. So wherever you look in water, it's interesting. And then obviously there's purpose as well, which we can do here.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our two guests for their insights. For more information on Europe's Environment 2025 report, you can visit us at the eea.europa.eu, the European Environment Agency's website, where you'll also find more information on our other climate, environment, and sustainability work. We'll see you next time.